The political crisis in Ivory Coast has suffered a new setback. President-elect Alassane Ouattara is rejecting an African Union mediator over consultation issues. This comes as U.S. President Barack Obama says the country's incumbent president needs to step down. VOA's Stearns has the story.
Supporters of the United Nations certified winner of Ivory Coast's presidential election say they'll continue their fight after Alassane Ouattara rejected the African Union's choice of a mediator in the political crisis. Pro-Ouattara militia now control much of Abidjan's Abobo neighborhood, where they're led by a man who calls himself Colonel Bauer. He says they're fighting incumbent President Laurent Gbagbo because he's blocking democracy.
Since Gbagbo came to power, peace is slipping further and further away from us. That's why we are rising today to fight against that.
Bauer says they're fighting not to kill Mr. Gbagbo, but to drive him from power. Gbagbo supporters say they're fighting to defend his re-election against what they say are pro-Ouattara rebels who tried to steal the vote with the help of the United Nations and much of the international community. Gbagbo youth leader Charles-Blé Goudé led an all-night vigil in front of the presidential palace to show what he says is the commitment of Gbagbo supporters to resolve the political crisis peacefully.
We are determined to avoid civil war in Ivory Coast. Those who take to the streets empty-handed, who come together here, those who will sleep under the sky, these are not violent people. These are not the assassins, the murderers. The murderers are those who are hiding in the neighborhoods with their Kalashnikovs, killing and slitting people's throats under the eyes of the UN. This is to show our spirit of peace.
Human Rights Watch says pro-Gbagbo militia and soldiers are engaged in a campaign of violence against Ouattara supporters that may constitute war crimes. U.S. President Barack Obama called on Mr. Gbagbo to choose peace for his country and step down.
Now Côte d'Ivoire is at a crossroad, and two paths lay ahead. One path is where Laurent Gbagbo and his supporters cling to power, which will only lead to more violence, more innocent civilians being wounded and killed, and more diplomatic and economic isolation. Or Côte d'Ivoire can take another path, where Gbagbo follows the example of leaders who reject violence and abide by the will of the people, where Ivorians reclaim your country and rebuild a vibrant economy that was once the admiration of Africa, and where Côte d'Ivoire is welcomed back into the community of nations.
France wants the UN Security Council to impose sanctions on Mr. Gbagbo and his allies. Ivory says the cause of this political crisis is clear. Mr. Gbagbo does not want to leave.
We would want to forbid the heavy weapons from the Abidjan area. You may be aware that actually the Gbagbo people have used mortars against civilian neighborhoods. So it was very important. It's very important to do it. And we want also to go to sanctions against Gbagbo and his close advisors in the resolution.
A draft resolution by France and Nigeria will be discussed at the United Nations this week. Nigeria has led regional threats to raise a West African intervention force to drive Mr. Gbagbo from power. African Union efforts to mediate a peaceful end to this crisis now appear stalled, with Mr. Ouattara's rejection of a former foreign minister from Cape Verde, who he says is too close to Mr. Gbagbo to be a neutral mediator. Scott Stearns, VOA News, Dakar.